We are going to present excerpts from the speeches of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. The source of the recording is All India Radio's Sound Archives.
Our difficulty is not with regard to the ultimate. Our difficulty is with regard to the beginning. Mr. Chairman, therefore, I should have thought that in order to make a start, in order to induce every party, every section in this country, it would be the act of greatest statesmanship for the majority party even to make a concession to the prejudices of people who are not prepared to march together. And it is for that I propose to make this appeal. Let us leave aside slogans. Let us leave aside words which frighten people. Let us even make concession to the prejudices of our opponents. Bring them in so that they may willingly join with us on marching upon that road, which, as I said, if we walk long enough, must necessarily lead us to unity. And if I therefore, from this place, support Dr. Jaikar's amendment, it is because I want all of us to realize that whether we are right or wrong, whether the position that we take is consonance with our legal rights, whether that accords with the statement of May 16th or December 16th, leave all that aside. This is too big a question to be reduced to the position of mere legality. It is not a legal question. I say leave aside all these considerations and make some attempt whereby those who are not prepared to come will come. Let us make it possible for them to come. That is my appeal. In the course of the debate that took place, there were two questions which were raised, which struck me so well that I took the trouble of taking them down on a note paper. The one question was, it was asked, I think, by my friend, the Prime Minister of Bihar, who spoke yesterday in this assembly. He said, how can this resolution prevent the League from coming into the Constituent Assembly? Today, my friend Dr. Shyam Prasad Mukherjee asked another question. Is this resolution inconsistent with the Cabinet Mission's proposal? Now, sir, I think they were very important questions. And they, I think, ought to be answered. And answered categorically. I do maintain that this resolution, whether it is intended to bring about the result or not, whether it is the result of cold calculation, or whether it is a mere matter of accident, is bound to have the result of keeping the Muslim League out. And I'll substantiate what I said. Sir, I invite your attention to paragraph 3 in the resolution, which I think is very significant and very important. Paragraph 3 envisages the future constitution of India I do not know what is the intention of the mover of the resolution. But I take it that it is a sort of, after this resolution is passed, it will act as a sort of a directive to the Constituent Assembly to frame the Constitution in terms of paragraph 3 of the resolution. What does paragraph 3 speak of? Paragraph 3 says that in this country there shall be two different sets of polity. One at the bottom, the autonomous provinces or the states, or such other areas as care to join the United India. These autonomous units will have full powers. They will have also residuary powers. At the top and over the provincial units, there will be a union government having certain subjects for legislation, for execution and for administration. Sir, as I read this part of the resolution, I do not find any reference to the idea of grouping an intermediary structure between the union on the one hand and the provinces on the other. Now, reading this paragraph in the light of the cabinet mission's statement, or reading it even in the light of the resolution passed by the Congress at its Wardha session, I must confess that I am a great deal surprised at the absence of any reference to the idea of the grouping of the provinces. So far as I am personally concerned, I do not like the idea of grouping. I like a strong, united center. Much stronger than the center we had created under the Government of India Act of 1935. But sir, these opinions, these wishes have no bearing on the situation at all. We have traveled a long road. The Congress party, for the reasons best known to itself, consented, if I may use the expression, to the dismantling of a strong center which had grown into this country as a result of 150 years of administration, and which I must say was to me a matter of great admiration and respect. But having given up that position, having said that we do not want a strong center, and having accepted that there must be or should be an intermediate polity, a sub-federation between the union government and the provinces, I like to know why there is no reference in paragraph 3 to the idea of grouping. I quite understand that the Congress party, the Muslim League, and His Majesty's government is not ad idem on the interpretation of that particular idea about grouping. But I always thought, and I will be prepared to stand corrected if it's shown that I am wrong, that at least it was agreed by the Congress party that is the provinces who are to be within the different groups consent to form a union or a sub-federation, the Congress would have no objection to that proposal. I believe I am correct in interpreting the mind of the Congress party. So the question that I ask is this: why did not the mover of this resolution make reference to the idea of having a union of the provinces or a group of provinces on the terms on which he and his party was prepared to accept? Why is the idea of union completely effaced from this resolution? I find no answer.
I had not enough notice that I was to speak here. And when I was asked what subject I would speak on, I mentioned the subject of ahimsa in Buddhism. But I find that a large majority of the people attending this conference are desirous that I should speak on Buddhism and communism. Although I must say that I am not quite on the spur of the moment prepared to deal with such a large, enormous, and if I may say so, a very massive subject. A subject which has held half the world in grip. And I find that it has held also in its grip large number of the student population, even of the Buddhist countries. I look upon the latter aspect of the matter with grave concern. If the younger generation of the Buddhist countries are not able to appreciate that Buddhism supplies a way of life which is better than what is supplied by the communist way of life, Buddhism is doomed. It cannot last beyond a generation or two. It is therefore quite necessary for those who believe in Buddhism to tackle the younger generation and to tell them whether Buddhism can be a substitute for communism. It is then only that Buddhism can hope to survive. We must all remember that today a large majority of the people in Europe, a large majority of the youngsters in Asia look upon Karl Marx as the only prophet who could be worshipped. And they regard, I need not say much about it, regard large part of the Buddhist priesthood as nothing but yellow peril. That is an indication which the bhikkhus must take up, must understand, must reform themselves in order that they could be compared with Karl Marx and Buddhism could compete with it. Now with this introduction, I propose to give you a few salient points in Buddhism and in Marxism or communism, in order to show you where the similarity of ideals lies, where the differences arise between Buddhism and Marxism, and thirdly, whether the Buddhist way of life of reaching the goal which communism has is a lasting one, or whether the communist way of bringing about the goal is the lasting one. Because there is no use in pursuing a certain path if that path is not going to be a lasting path. If it is going to lead you to jungle, if it is going to lead you to anarchy, there is no use pursuing it. But if you are assured that the path that you are asked to follow is slow, maybe devious, maybe there are long detours, but if it ultimately makes you land on a safe on a sound ground, so that the ideals you are pursuing are there to help you to mold your life permanently and forever, is much better, in my judgment, to follow the slower path and the deterrence path rather than to rush up and to take what we call shortcuts. Shortcuts in life are always very dangerous. Very dangerous. Now let me go to the subject. What is the theory of communism? What does it start with? Communism starts with the theory that there is exploitation in the world, that the poor are exploited by the rich because of the property that they hold, and they enslave the masses. That enslavement results in suffering, in sorrow, in poverty. That is the starting point of Karl Marx. He uses the word exploitation. What is the remedy that Karl Marx provides? The remedy that Karl Marx provides is that in order to prevent poverty, suffering of one class, it is necessary to prevent private property. Nobody should possess private property because it is the private owner who appropriates or misappropriates, to use the technical language of Karl Marx, the surplus value which the worker produces. The worker does not get the surplus value which he produces. It is appropriated by the owner. And Marx asked the question, why should he? Why should the owner misappropriate this surplus value which is produced by the effort of the working man? His answer is that the only owner is the state. And it is because of this that Marx propounded the theory that there must be the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is the third proposition that Marx enunciated. That government must be by the exploited classes and not by the exploiting classes, which is what is meant by dictatorship of the proletariat. These are fundamental propositions in Karl Marx, which are the basis of communism in Russia. It has undoubtedly been expanded, it has been added to, and so on. But these are the fundamental propositions. Now let me for a moment go to Buddhism and see what the Buddha has to say about the points made out by Karl Marx. As I told you, Karl Marx begins with what is called exploitation of the poor. What does the Buddha say? How does he begin? What is the foundation on which he has raised the structure of his religion? The Buddha too, 2000 or at any rate 2,400 years ago, said exactly the same thing. He said, there is dukkha in the world. He did not use the word exploitation, but he did lay the foundation of his religion on what he called dukkha. There is dukkha in the world. The word dukkha, no doubt, has been interpreted in various ways. It has been interpreted to mean rebirth, the round of life. That is dukkha. I do not agree with that. I think there are a lot of places in the Buddhist literature where the Buddha has used the word dukkha in the sense of poverty. Therefore, so far as the foundation is concerned, there is really no difference at all. It is unnecessary for the Buddhist people to go to Karl Marx to get that foundation. That foundation is already there, well laid, well laid. It is the first proposition with which the Buddha begins his first sermon, the Dhammacakra Parivartana Sutta. Therefore, those who are attracted by Karl Marx, I say study the Dhammacakra Parivartana Sutta and find out what the Buddha says. And you will find sufficient satisfaction on this question. The Buddha did not lay the foundation of his religion either on God or on soul or anything supernatural as to that. He laid his finger on the fact of life. People are living in suffering. Therefore, so far as Marxism or communism is concerned, Buddhism has enough of it. And the Buddha has said it 2,000 years before Marx was born. With regard to the question of property, you will again find some very close affinity to the doctrines of the Buddha and the doctrine speech by Karl Marx. Karl Marx said that in order to prevent exploitation, the state must own the instruments of production. That is property. Land must belong to the state. Industry must belong to the state. So that no private owner intervenes and robs the worker of the profits of his labor. That is what Marx said. Now let us go to the Sangha, the Buddhist Sangha, and examine the rules of life that the Buddha laid down for the monk. What are the rules that the Buddha laid down? Well, the Buddha said that no monk shall have private property. Ideally speaking, no monk can own property. And although there might be a few lapses here and there, and I have noticed that in some countries the monks own property, yet in the large majority of the cases the monks have no property. No property at all. In fact, the Buddhist rules for the Sangha are far more severe than any rules that the communists have made in Russia. I take it is a moot subject. Nobody has yet discussed it and come to any conclusion. What object did the Buddha have in forming the Sangha? Why did he do it? Going back a little into the history, when the Buddha was engaged in propagating his religion, what we today call the Parivrajaka, they were existing there long before the Buddha was there. The word Parivrajaka means a displaced person, a person who has lost his home. Probably during the Aryan period, the different tribes of the Aryans were warring against one another, as all tribal people do. Some broken tribes lost their moorings, and they were wandering about. It is those wanderers that were called Parivrajaka. The great service that the Buddha did to these Parivrajaka's was to organize them into a body, to give them rules of life, what are contained in the Vinaya Pitaka. In the rules, the bhikkhu is not allowed to have property. The bhikkhu is allowed to have only 7 things. 7. A razor, a lota for getting water, a bhiksha patra, the 3 chivaras, and a needle for sewing things. Well, I want to know if the essence of communism is to deny private property, can there be any greater and a more severe rule as regards private property than is to be found in the Vinaya Pitaka? I do not. I do not find it. Therefore, if any people or any youngsters are attracted by the rule contained in the communist system of rules, that there shall be no private property, they can find it here. The only question is, to what extent can we apply this rule of denial of private property to society as a whole? But that is a matter of expediency, time, circumstances, development of human society. But so far as theory is concerned, whether there is anything wrong in abolishing private property, Buddhism will not stand in the way of anybody who wants to do it. Because it has already made this concession in the organization of the Buddhist Sangha. Now we come to another aspect of the matter, and that aspect is, what is the ways and means which Karl Marx or the communists wish to adopt in order to bring about communism? That is the important question. The means that the communists wish to adopt in order to bring about communism, by which I mean, you see, the recognition of dukkha, the abolition of private property. The means that they wish to adopt is violence and killing of the opponent. There lies the fundamental difference between the Buddha and Karl Marx. The Buddha's means of persuading people to adopt the principle is by persuasion, by moral teaching, by love. He wants to conquer his opponents by inculcating in them the doctrine that love can conquer anything and not power. That's where the fundamental difference lies, that the Buddha would not allow violence, and the communists do. No doubt, the communists get quick results, because when you adopt the means of annihilating him, he does not remain to oppose you. You go on with your ideology. You go on with your ways of doing things. The Buddha's way, as I said, is a long way. Perhaps some people may say a tedious way. But I have no doubt about it that it is the surest way.